Good evening and welcome back to the Journey Home program. My name is JonMarc Grodi. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the Coming Home Network. I'm guest hosting for my Father Marcus tonight here on the Journey Home for a special episode, a special edition. This is another roundtable, and we're welcoming back two really neat guests that you might have seen recently on the show. The first is Dr. Rachel Liu. She's a former Mormon, a PhD in philosophy from Cornell, and writer at various Catholic publications, or lots of different publications, yeah. And Dr. Jonathan Fuqua, a former evangelical Protestant, and the assistant professor of philosophy at Conception Seminary College in Missouri. I think I got both those mostly right. Yeah. And welcome back to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Rachel.
Thank you.
So we're really excited to have you back because there were some interesting connections between your two stories the first time around. You both come from sort of beyond the mainstream Christianity. You know, oneness Pentecostalism on the one hand, and then Mormonism on the other, you know, a bit further beyond than many of our guests. But you also have a background in roots and interest in philosophy in your various stories and capacities. And we wanted to get back together to talk about that. So we'll start there. I'll start with you, Jonathan. Let's go back to the beginning because we haven't heard your story for a little while. Give us a little refresher on why you're Catholic. But starting at the beginning, also talk a little bit about how the role of philosophy, the role of asking questions, seeking truth played into that story. And I guess real quickly before we go into that, again, philosophy, what does the word mean? It's the love of wisdom. And so I think as we'll talk about later, while you both have academic background in philosophy, when we're talking about philosophy, we're not just talking about these specific strict academic discipline, but more that way of life, that way of approaching reality. Whatever your position in life, whatever your vocation is, philosophy is something that we all participate in. So give us a refresher on your theological background, why you're Catholic, and how philosophy played a role in that.
Sure. So one way to think of my story is as a journey from Azusa to Wheaton to Rome.
Right.
So Pentecostalism begins with Azusa Street revivals in Los Angeles in the early 20th century. And Wheaton is kind of the cultural epicenter of evangelical Protestantism. Right. And so I began life, as you mentioned, as a oneness Pentecostal. And meaning that I didn't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. I thought it was a polytheistic pagan corruption of true biblical Christianity. Mm-hmm. I thought that you had to speak in tongues in order to be saved. Mm-hmm. So that meant all the other Christians who had never spoken in tongues were lost. Mm-hmm. And they were just as much a part of the mission field as an atheist or a Hindu. Right. And my oneness Pentecostal tradition was very anti-intellectual. And it was very anti-Catholic. Mm-hmm. So I was taught growing up that, the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon from the book of Revelation. Right. And that the false prophet, that notorious sidekick of the Antichrist, was going to be the Pope someday. So when I went to college, though, my horizons expanded in terms of who gets to count as a genuine Christian. Right. My parents eventually took us to a more mainstream Pentecostal church, and then in college, my faith came under fire from professors and classmates who were all very respectful, but they presented objections, intellectual objections that I didn't know how to answer. And I stumbled into Christian apologetics and started reading Christian philosophy and theology. And many of the people I was reading, they weren't Catholic or they weren't Pentecostal at all. Right. Some of them were Catholic, in fact. Many of them were evangelical Protestants. And so I started to learn a more historically grounded, theologically sophisticated version of Christianity was possible. Mm-hmm. And I was heavily influenced by many of these writers. And so I kind of moved and shifted from being a Pentecostal to being an evangelical Protestant. That's how I saw myself. Yeah. When I went to graduate school, one of my professors joined the Catholic Church that I'd gone to Baylor to study with. And several of my classmates also joined the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And this really forced me to start considering, really for the first time, the possibility that maybe Catholicism was actually correct. Mm-hmm. Maybe that Jesus really founded a church and it was the Catholic Church. And so I was forced once again to expand my horizons in terms of who got to count as a genuine Christian. And so I started reading contemporary Catholic writers and then kind of worked my way back, reading Vatican II documents. And part of as my philosophical training, I was also reading Catholic philosophers like St. Augustine, and St. Thomas, and I was thoroughly impressed with their brilliance and their synthesis of faith and reason. Yeah. And they weren't just clever intellects; they were saintly, virtuous people. They had this combination of mind and heart that, as a former anti-intellectual Pentecostal who was growing to this more theologically serious version of Christianity, I was wrestling with, how do you reconcile the mind and the heart, faith and reason? Yeah. And I saw in these great Catholic thinkers and saints and doctors, I saw the reconciliation. I didn't have all the answers, but I saw the reconciliation. It was attractive. And so I kind of read my way eventually into the Catholic Church, and realized at some point that Catholicism is not just a theory that I can evaluate sitting in the armchair, as it were, but that if I'm going to join the Catholic Church, I've got to know that I can actually follow Jesus and be a disciple of Christ in the Catholic Church. And so my wife and I started experimenting, as it were, by going to Mass on a regular basis. And we really found that God was just drawing us into the church. And so a few years ago, we were all, my three daughters and I and my wife were all received into the church. And philosophy did play a significant role throughout this entire process. For one thing, many of the objections just to Christianity in general that I first encountered in college were based on certain philosophical ideas. For example, the anti-supernaturalist reading of Scripture, which requires us to sort of de-supernaturalize the biblical text, was really based on a deistic or even naturalistic metaphysics. But I thought, no, there are good reasons to think that God exists, and so there are good reasons to think that miracles are possible. And so we shouldn't automatically assume before we open the book and start studying it that it has to be de-supernaturalized. I thought the main objection to Christianity and theistic religion in general, the problem of evil, I thought that's really a philosophical problem. And I thought there were decent, good philosophical responses. And so studying philosophy really kind of saved my Christian faith in general. And then a second way that philosophy helped was that when you study philosophy and you study the history of philosophy, you can't escape Augustine, you can't escape Anselm, you can't escape Aquinas, you can't escape Bonaventure or Scotus. And even some of the early modern philosophers who are typically seen as taking the West kind of away from traditional Christian thought were themselves Catholic, Descartes being the chief example. And so as I studied philosophy, I couldn't deny the intellectual firepower of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And as a budding scholar who wanted to really become a philosopher, this was really impressive. And I was most impressed by the Catholics for some reason. It seemed that they were the most brilliant, clever, but also wise and virtuous people in the tradition. And I wanted to be like Augustine. I wanted to be like Aquinas.
That was a part from your story the first time around that I definitely wanted to get into. And we'll talk more about it later. But the connection here, I think, between the intellect and virtue, I think, is an important one. Because we sometimes we tend to assume, we think of ourselves as just really complicated processing machines. And these matters of truth are just matter of data and processing power.
That's right.
But is there a connection between your virtue, your moral direction, and your ability to know? And I think that you got into that a little bit with even this idea that you need to kind of try Catholicism out. You need to look at it from the inside a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a moral, traditional Western philosophy says there's a moral condition even on metaphysics. Because to submit to reality requires a certain level of humility. Right. If you're going to uncover the truth about reality, you've got to be willing to submit and follow the truth that you uncover. And so philosophy really is in the ancient and medieval worlds, especially in the ancient world, philosophy was really viewed as a way of life. These philosophers organized themselves into schools. They even would live together, and they had distinctive garb, and philosophy was really viewed as the pursuit of wisdom. And then the way the fathers integrated this into Christianity was the true philosophy, the wisdom that the philosophers were searching for and partially found. The wisdom of God was made man, Jesus Christ. So Christianity is the true philosophy. And then one final thing is about being a philosopher that helped me in this journey from Azusa to Rome is simply that when you get philosophically trained, I think you develop an ability to look at the big picture and see underlying principles. And that allowed me to kind of step back, I think, and see that in the big picture, in the scheme of things, sola scriptura was not only self-defeating because it's not contained in Scripture, but also was not a workable prescription for how Christianity could actually work.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, bringing us back up to speed, Jonathan. Rachel, I want you to do the same now, because there's so many ways we could go here, so many neat things we could talk about, but we don't want to get off too far ahead. So we're joined by Dr. Rachel Liu and Dr. Jonathan Fuqua. And so back to you, Rachel. Give us a refresher on your journey and how philosophy played a role in that.
Right, thank you. So I was born into a Mormon family, and I talked a little bit about this in my initial interview, but it was a really Mormon world that I grew up in, right? A Mormon immediate family, a Mormon extended family, that was really our community. And I was a pretty happy Mormon for quite a while, but in my adolescent years, I started to get frustrated with Mormonism, in part because I just felt like there weren't very good answers to many of the questions that I was starting to ask. I would ask questions, I wasn't that satisfied with the answers that I was getting, and then if I pressed further, it seemed like I was usually encouraged to seek out some sort of religious experience. I was told, pray, or like get up in church on the microphone and bear your testimony to us, or something along those lines, right? And to me, it was partly the inappropriateness of those responses that further increased my sort of suspicions and my sense of discomfort in the church, right? It just seemed clear to me that if you have an intellectual problem, you shouldn't just solve it by trying to pray for affirming feelings, right? You need to be continuing to seek the sort of answer that the question calls for, right? And there were various grounds. I think the grounds there were partly sort of historical, ecclesiological types of concerns about the identity of the Mormon Church. Some of them had to do with Scripture. But in general, there was just this larger sense, you might even say, faith and reason were not really harmonized in the Mormon faith. I wouldn't exactly say that it's deeply anti-intellectual. They certainly don't think of themselves that way. Right. But when they reach a point, if you find yourself at the end of a dead end, then they're just pretty happy to say, well, just pray, right? So I actually started college at the University of Notre Dame. That happened for contingent family reasons, not because I was looking for Catholicism in any way. But once I started studying philosophy and theology at the University of Notre Dame, it really was like, I discussed this in my original interview, but the first book that I was given in my first theology class was a little collection of homilies from Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, A Catholic Understanding of the Creation and the Fall. And just reading that book, I immediately had this sense that I was dealing with something of a whole different order from any of the religious instruction that I had had previously. Just the breadth and depth and wisdom that he had, and the way that you could see that this was a person who had the grounding and the confidence to approach difficult questions without fear, right? Without feeling like you might find a place where you're uncomfortable with where you're going, and then you need to back off and just say a prayer.
Which is that virtue, He comes at it with a certain courage and humility to really want to seek the answers, whatever they are.
Yeah, exactly. And that if we do it in the right spirit, and if we do it with God's help, then it'll be okay. We're going to go to places that will bring us back to God, right? And I think I just sensed that. I got that impression immediately when I was reading that book. And it really did sort of start a whole new period of my life. I remember my undergraduate years as being like this kind of intellectual romp in a way, right? I took all these, I did a philosophy and theology major and, take classes in all these different, areas of philosophy and theology. And in each case, right, it seemed like all of those same qualities that made Mormonism so frustrating actually made this more fun, right? It's not that you understood everything immediately, but if you didn't understand it, then you were free to continue exploring it. And even if you did feel like there was some point where, prayer or religious experience were appropriate, they weren't in opposition to your intellectual energies. The two were fused together, right? You could maybe go to the grotto and pray for inspiration, but then you could come back and go on working on the problem intellectually. And those things came together in a supportive way. And that was just such a wonderful feeling. Over the long run, then so after that, I went into the Peace Corps. I spent a couple of years just reading lots and lots of books. And then I came back and started a graduate program in philosophy at Cornell, which is emphatically not a Catholic program, right? Very much a secular philosophy program. And it was really there that I started feeling like I needed to sort of make it official, right? I thought, join the side that I was on, right? Like if I'm going to be this sort of extreme outlier in this very secular program, and most philosophers in sort of the mainstream discipline are very much committed atheists, right? It's not even really something they debate in general. That's just how they are. So if I was going to be this kind of an outlier, I felt like I really needed sort of, some kind of support. And so I converted at the end of my first year of graduate school.
Very cool. One thing I was thinking about with both of your backgrounds, you described it as anti-intellectual, and you said not maybe so directly so, but maybe a bit of that there.
Yeah.
Would you say though that the traditions very clearly articulated the doctrines? Because what's interesting to me here is, if you don't have clearly articulated beliefs, you can't ask good questions. And so even if the tradition is a little suspicious of the reason, if it's clearly articulated its beliefs, it's fertile ground for asking about those beliefs.
Right.
How did what do you think about that? Was that a part of, were those beliefs clearly articulated such that your questions could have fertile ground to kind of grow in?
Yeah, they were. I mean, that's actually the paradox of the Pentecostal background.
Right.
Is that there's an emphasis, especially in Oneness Pentecostalism, on the truth.
Yeah.
Like, we really know the truth. The Bible really is true, and it's extremely important. Your eternal destiny depends on knowing and living the truth. But there was also this idea that you could get easy, direct access to the truth with very little intellectual effort just by opening the Bible and interpreting it for yourself.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, again, it's something in the modern world. I think Chesterton made this point at one point in one of his essays about how we've moved away from sort of dogmatic doctrinal points of belief in the hope that it will lead to more fertile and respectful discourse. But the opposite has happened. When we have vague beliefs, we can't ask good questions, and so we stay out of each other's way.
Right.
Yeah.
And because I cared so much about the truth, that was one of the seed beds in my foundation that helped me to fall in love with philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom, and then eventually led me all the way into the church.
Yeah.
I think it's also really interesting. This was something that I noticed when I first was encountering sort of, the early church councils, patristics, some of that kind of stuff. Many of these sort of fundamental or these long-standing Christian dogma were things that I was taught as a Mormon to reject, and was given a kind of straightforward, relatively facile argument for why they were ridiculous, right? Like, 3 and 1, that just makes no sense. It's 3 or it's 1, right? We can't do that. Original sin, babies are born guilty. I mean, come on, So in a way, it's so easy to knock those down, right? But one thing that I realized when I was reading about sort of early church theology, it's not like other people didn't realize that these were problematic, or, well, problematic's the wrong word. I mean, that this was very confusing and strange and didn't seem like it could be right. But they didn't try to pretend that there was some simple answer to that, right? In some ways, the fact that multiple councils in each of these cases, or again, the divinity and humanity of Christ is another one of those examples, right? There were lots of easy solutions to the problem. The church kept saying, no, 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 and they drew a kind of a fence around it, right? It's not this, it's not that, it's not the other thing. But those ended up being these just unbelievably sort of fertile mysteries, right? They're remembered as mysteries, and then they're mysteries from which all kinds of other amazing things have flowed, right? And so completely unlike many of the kinds of conundrums that I was butting my head against as a Mormon teenager, where I was like, okay, so we just have no answers to this, and the end. That's not the way that real Christian mystery should be approached, right? When we have a fertile mystery, no, we keep coming back to it again and again and again. But instead of feeling like we're butting our heads into a wall, we find that sort of springs of living water are flowing from it.
Some of the best, most fruitful philosophy in the tradition was done in a theological context. Trying to think about these mysteries in a responsible way that respected both reason and revelation.
Yeah, try never to go either route of merely simplifying the mystery into one easy either or, but nor abandoning the mystery, and simply treating it fideistically. Like, no, when we encounter a mystery, if we've if we've dispersed all the things that it's definitely not, and we're left with a mystery, then we retain the mystery and we keep hammering away at it.
Right.
So again, one thing I wanted to get into here, something that I think all three of us share with probably most people in the audience, is we didn't set out to be philosophers. Even from your particular religious backgrounds, there wasn't necessarily that bent, that emphasis, that encouragement. But as I mentioned earlier, I guess to answer this question for the audience, maybe starting with you, Jonathan. So what is philosophy? Is this something that does the audience have to go get a graduate degree in philosophy to be part of this discussion, or is it maybe something more than that traditionally?
Yeah, there's some really good accessible philosophy. And some of the best, most important, most profound philosophical thinkers in the history of the Western intellectual tradition have actually written pretty accessible things that a normal person could read. So you could go read Plato's dialogues, for example, and they're entertaining, they're good literature. There's a ton of great philosophy. Right. You could go read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and it's very accessible. It's challenging. It's going to force you to think, just like Plato, but it's accessible. That's actually in contrast to much contemporary philosophy, which is written for specialists and which is not accessible to the normal person.
Yeah.
But historically, philosophy is the love of wisdom. It's the pursuit of wisdom, trying to understand the nature and structure of reality, and trying to answer the question, how should I live? And so every human being asks him or herself philosophical questions. Yeah. Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? Do I have a soul? Does life have meaning or purpose? What's the right way to live? What's just? What's knowledge? What's truth? So there's no question of having philosophical views. There's only a question of thinking about these questions and trying to responsibly come up with a true set of answers so you can have wisdom, or just being the plaything of the cultural ideas which happen to dominate in the society you grew up in.
Right.
And so Christians should pursue wisdom, obviously. And many of the preambles of the Catholic faith can be known by human reason and can even be buttressed by philosophy. We can know via human reason that God exists. We can know via human reason there's a moral law. Right. We can even provide arguments for God's existence. We can provide arguments about the nature of evil as a privation or perversion of the good. And so I think it's in Hebrews where the New Testament says, he that comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Well, knowing that God exists, that God rewards those who seek him, that there's a moral law, that you violated it, those are all philosophical ideas that have to be believed before you can fruitfully approach Catholicism.
Right. Yeah, even in the word, the love of philosophy, love of wisdom, I feel like you, again, even there have a connection between, again, your ability to know, your ability to approach truth is contingent on whether you have this love, and that's something accessible to everybody.
That's right. Yeah, Plato said, there are three kinds of people, honor lovers, lovers of pleasure, and lovers of wisdom. Yeah. And so the philosopher is a lover. Yeah. Augustine picked this theme up as well. Yeah. A lover of wisdom. Yeah.
In your two individual lives, where do you think that love of wisdom came from? Was it more sort of in your temperament, your character, Rachel? Or is it something that you learned? Was it part of your family culture to ask questions, to pursue wisdom, or how did it come about?
I think it was definitely a part of the culture of my family. My father is a conservative law professor. My mother was eventually trained as a historian. I mentioned that he's a conservative law professor just because that probably gives people roughly the right associations, although we really weren't a very political family, right? We didn't grow up talking a lot about electoral politics or that sort of thing. But we were a family that was pretty oriented around, you might say, Western civilization and that kind of stuff. So my parents exposed us to just a kind of wide range of stuff, right? But kind of from the Western canon. And actually when I was, probably I was temperamentally inclined that way anyway, but when I was, I think 14, I had a period when, complicated story, but basically we were living in a place for a relatively brief period of time where there wasn't really time for me to make friends or sort of get involved in things, and I was kind of hanging around without much to do. And my dad gave me a copy of the Apology. just kind of, oh, why don't you read this if you're bored today? So Plato's Apology, right? The story of Socrates, the trial of Socrates is what it actually is. But it's kind of one of those things that you give to freshmen in college to sort of get them thinking about philosophy. And I read that, and that just seemed mind-blowing to me. Wow, that is just amazing, right? So I think I did get a fair amount of that, such that when I got to college and those verdant fields were opening, I was already inclined to do it. But I also think that in our time, there have been other periods in history where it was more possible to just kind of do the done thing and you would be okay, right? You could just kind of, follow along with whatever it was that was expected. Social norms kind of set certain boundaries on we're not living in one of those times, right? So I feel with my children, and I think my parents had some awareness of this too, the basic idea that Aristotle has is just as rational beings, we need to learn how to live in accord with reason. That is, we need to use our rational powers to figure out the right way to live, and that should be applicable to really everything that we do. And I think that basic paradigm is kind of invaluable in our time, right? When we're dealing with all of these questions about how to live, we really need to have some kind of a discipline in place, some kind of a paradigm to help us think, what is the right way to approach this? How should I do this in a way that will make me a more moral person and make my life better?
Yeah, it's almost, there's like a baseline moral duty there. I don't have an underlying moral duty to go become an academic philosopher.
Right.
But we all have this moral duty to try to seek out that truth, to approach our life reasonably and intentionally.
Right.
And so, that's a good place for a break. So let's go to a break and we'll continue this conversation. Again, this is the Journey Home program. I am JonMarc Grodi, guest hosting for my father Marcus, and we're joined by Dr. Rachel Liu and Dr. Jonathan Fuqua, and we'll be right back. See you in a minute. Hello and welcome back to the second half of the Journey Home program. I'm JonMarc Grodi, guest hosting for my father Marcus. And tonight's episode is a roundtable on philosophy. We're joined by Dr. Rachel Liu and Dr. Jonathan Fuqua. And we've had a little refresher on your stories, and we've talked about some good angles connected to that. What we wanted to start into on this half of the program was, Dad has often talked, the story of how the Journey Home program came about was Mother Angelica's concern for many viewers is they have students or children that have left the faith. And so with this idea of philosophy, I want to talk for a moment about, what is the state of, you guys have exposure to philosophy departments, but what is the kind of the state of philosophy today? How does the world regard philosophy? And then we'll kind of link that to, our own friends and family, how that plays a role in their lives. Rachel, how does the world regard philosophy today? Are we a culture that seeks wisdom, that loves wisdom?
I think we're a very confused culture. I think we're a culture that is sort of grasping at whatever sources of meaning or purpose we can find because we don't really have much of a foundation to work from in doing that. So in that sense, then people can be powerfully attracted to sources of wisdom because they want it, right? But they don't necessarily know where to start from or where they're going, right? So we really are kind of seeking lost sheep, right? And I think that is one of the reasons why people who are not given good reasons to become or stay Catholic often don't, right? Because it isn't necessarily going to seem like the natural or obvious thing to do in a world like ours.
And that's connected off with how the faith is presented. What are some ways, for instance, Jonathan, that how do we fail in doing that sometimes, the way that we present the faith to our children? Yeah,
I've noticed in the few years I've been a Catholic that, parish level catechesis is very intellectually superficial. But both in terms of theology and in terms of any kind of philosophical rationale that might be understood as supporting the truth and defensibility of the faith. Catholics know, for example, that the Church teaches that we shouldn't use contraception, but they have no idea why. Catholics probably know that the church says we can know that God exists, but they don't know if there are any good reasons to think that God exists. And I think, and so when Catholic high schoolers go off to college and they encounter very sophisticated objections to their faith, they have no idea how to answer it. And I think you see this in two areas especially. Number one, science and religion. So there's a perceived conflict between science and religion in our culture. And that's a particular instance of a larger alleged conflict between faith and reason. Well, obviously, if you're going to be an intellectually respectable person, you've got to acknowledge that the real power of the natural sciences in giving us knowledge. And so if there is a real conflict between science and faith, then that puts us into the position of being a fideist, sticking our heads in the sands and ignoring the deliverances of the sciences, or giving up the faith altogether, or maybe radically watering it down so that it bears virtually no resemblance to the faith of the great saints who came before. And then with respect to morality, I think a lot of modern people believe that Christianity is just immoral, that especially Catholic moral teaching is not only incorrect but even dangerous. So there's this perceived conflict between what reason tells us about morality and what the Catholic Church says about morality. It's really the discipline of philosophy that can help bring back the reconciliation of faith and reason, particularly in science and religion debates, and also show that Catholic moral teaching is actually defensible. It's actually based on a good understanding of human nature, which can also be found in the best philosophers like Plato and Aristotle.
Right. Yeah, the faith and reason, even the question of is there a conflict, or what is the conflict, or can they be reconciled, that itself is a philosophical question.
It is.
One thing I was thinking of is we use a lot of these terms. I think we're pretty clear on what reason is, but what do we mean when we use the word faith? And not necessarily the faith as a deposit of knowledge or of doctrine, but what does the act of reason mean versus the act of faith? I feel like that's an important question that many parents wouldn't know how to answer for their children. If the child asks, "What does it mean to have faith?" What do we answer them? Rachel, any thoughts of that? Or Jonathan, either of you?
Go ahead.
Well, we're given faith at our baptism, right? It's actually a little bit complicated to talk about that with children, right? That on the one hand, faith is something that is given to us, and on the other hand, it's something that we develop, right? So it's a supernatural gift, and yet at the same time, there's this very natural component to it as we continue to learn and develop our faith in different sorts of ways. Sometimes I think it can be, it's not totally right, but pretty good to use some of these kind of like seed types of analogies, right? I mean, there can be things that are rooted in a miracle. What causes that green leaf to spring out of the ground? It's amazing, but then requires a lot of sort of ordinary forms of tending. It needs its water and its soil and its sunshine and all of those kinds of things. And I think that can be a good way to think about it for children. And especially, you can supplement that with things like the parable of the laborer. That goes well with the seed analogies, right? Where you say, well, you can have something, the seed just springs out of the soil. In that sense, it's a gift. It comes from someplace else. But the environment of the world is really harsh. So we need to nourish our faith through the feeding of our reason, right? We use our reason to supplement it and build it up and make it tougher and stronger and more adaptable, right? So that we can survive the harsh environment of the world.
Yeah. I think in some sense, we can talk about faith in a very specific religious sense, but I think more broadly, a certain type of faith is involved in all of our knowledge and all of our truth seeking.
Yeah, that's right. Faith in a more theological sense is a supernatural gift, as Rachel said, and it was understood by Aquinas as a kind of habit that perfects the intellect's ability to know God. Yeah. But in this broader sense of trust, everybody has faith. Right. Even to try to inquire about the nature of the world, whether it's in physics or chemistry or to do history or psychology or math, you have to trust that your cognitive faculties actually put you in touch with reality. Yeah. And there can be no non-circular argument for the reliability of your cognitive faculties, because any argument that you give for their reliability would require you to use them thus presupposing that they're reliable, which is the very thing that you're supposed to prove.
Yeah.
And inquiry also requires faith as trust in the sense that you have to trust that the world is intelligible.
Yeah.
That being, as medieval philosophers would say, that being is intelligible.
Mm-hmm.
And so those assumptions that drive human inquiry and the progress that can be made in reason, those assumptions are best made in a context of faith, in the sense of a deposit of faith.
Right.
So I think really faith saves reason, I think, and allows reason to pursue the task of understanding.
Right. Rather than devolving into skepticism.
Exactly.
Like that. It strikes me that a lot of the questions that, the viewers as children or people are asking in the culture, oftentimes we're asking about the surface level moral conclusions, for instance, not recognizing that to get there, you have to address whether or not we even are on the same universe in terms of the underlying philosophical worldview.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That seems right. And it seems like a lot of times, so part of the problem that we have is that we get a lot of the instruction, or our faith is nourished through deep kind of traditional roots, the deep roots of a lengthy tradition.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's a really wonderful thing. In many ways, that's a wonderful thing. But the world is moving so quickly that tradition can't always sort of grow quickly enough to offer super on point, nuanced, perfectly applicable answers to all the contemporary questions as they arise, right? It's just moving so fast. Yeah. And sometimes there are questions, it's not that we can't answer them or we have no resources to answer them. It's just, again, like we haven't necessarily agreed on and worked out perfect answers to them yet, right? Right. And so when that happens, then a lot of times people either want to answer the question too quickly or with insufficient nuance, which can end up driving people away, right? Oh, is that the Christian answer? Well, I don't believe that. I guess I'm out the door, right? Or just sort of give up and conclude, well, I guess the faith is not that good. It doesn't have any answers for us, right? Yeah. And so we just need to have the patience, the willingness to stick with things, to keep working at them, but also to be willing to kind of live with a level of uncertainty sometimes as we continue to formulate answers to, and I'm thinking here about lots of difficult questions, questions about the nature of work and social justice and how we're supposed to live together in one nation with people who don't believe what we believe, and all of these questions that are really pressing on us right now. Yeah. It's hard to have patience as we try to figure out the answers to those, but sometimes that's what we have to do.
Yeah. And there's another virtue, again, coming up in this, that, to do that well, we need that patience. Yeah. There's this deep connection between the kind of people we are and whether we're able to think these kind of thoughts and pursue the truth, but also our ability to have that dialogue with other people. So we have a question here. I'm gonna read this question. Mark from Ohio asks, Scripture says that the, quote, fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Few people in the church today though talk about the fear of God. Is the lack of the fear of God a reason for the lack of wisdom in our culture? Jonathan.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, you can't fear God unless you take God seriously. And if you don't take God seriously, you're not going to find real wisdom, right? So I think fear of God means taking.
I mean, even the question of God, taking that seriously,
right? Right. And the fear of God, I think, includes a willingness to submit yourself to reality as it is in itself. And we're seeing a buck against that, right? We're seeing a culture that wants to create reality in its own image. It wants to construct reality. We're seeing a constructivist culture that rejects the givenness of creation and says, no, I'll make reality conform to my desires rather than conforming my desires to reality. And so I think the fear of God is probably a key to being willing to conform your desires to reality rather than the other way around.
Right. Rachel, we know that the world today is very confused and muddled on these points, but is there a hunger for this underlying that? Like how do we wake people back up to asking these sorts of questions?
I think there's definitely a hunger for it. I think that people want more meaning. They want to find places that can supply answers to some of these questions. And that makes me hopeful a lot of the time because I feel like, well, we do have incredible opportunities if we can find, if we keep working at it, sometimes you can find the right thing to say to put someone on the right track. You can find different ways to help people find these sources of meaning that they're seeking. It's really actually quite depressing sometimes to think about the number of people in the world today who are living with these tremendous burdens of emptiness and loneliness and guilt. I think that relates to the fear of God too, right? That when we don't have a culture that can really make sense of sin, people end up living with these enormous burdens of guilt that they don't know what to do with because they don't even understand what sin is, right? And so I think there is a tremendous hunger for help in sorting all of those problems out. And sometimes with just individual people in our lives, if we keep working at it, sometimes we can find a place to offer that help.
Yeah. Without forgiveness, the moral law is pretty demanding.
Right.
And without we all know that we violate it.
Yeah.
Without the possibility of forgiveness, it becomes too much to bear. And so we're depressed and we have to reject the moral law and say because we can't live by it, and we can't live with the thought that we are every day violating it.
Right.
And often we can't even articulate what we've done wrong in the first place, right? You even have to start with, okay, so here's what a human being is supposed to do, and here's why you're not doing it, right? You can't even articulate that problem.
Right.
Yeah. Let's take another question here. So this is Glenn from Tampa, Florida. In your opinion, who are a few of the best philosophers that the Western world needs to better appreciate and understand today? And how can a non-scholar become more familiar with some of the basics of sound philosophy? Where are some starting points for viewers, perhaps? Maybe we mentioned a couple of them earlier, some of the Greeks.
Yeah, start with the dialogues of Plato. It's not the only place to start, but that's one of the great places to start. There's a lot of truth in Plato. Some of the early church fathers, as I mentioned before, I think viewed Plato and Aristotle as sort of being God's way of preparing the Gentiles for the gospel. And so there's a lot of truth in Plato and Aristotle. It's very consonant. There's some error, right? And this is partly why Aquinas says we need theology in addition to philosophy, because the stuff we can know about God through reason is mixed in with error. And so theology certainly has to correct philosophy. But yeah, I say start with Plato and Aristotle. Read Augustine. Augustine's prose is beautiful. And there's a lot of great theology and a lot of great philosophy in Augustine as well. And I think St. Anselm, a medieval philosopher, it can also be pretty accessible. Aquinas, I think, is more challenging for beginners, but there are lots of books about Aquinas that that are written for lay people. I think Peter Kraft has got a Summa of the Summa and a shorter Summa, and there are a lot of good Catholic philosophers today. People like Edward Feser, for example, or Peter Kraft. Dr. Rachel Liu, who are presenting the ideas of the Catholic philosophical tradition to a broader audience in ways that are accessible.
Right.
I would also mention, we were discussing earlier our shared love of Josef Pieper. I think he's very good and has some really readable work, and work that is really applicable to ordinary people's lives. I think that's one of his gifts too.
Yeah, again, when we discover, or perhaps we need to point out to people when we're talking about kind of these, not surface, I don't want to say surface level questions, but moral conclusions that are very far down the line from your worldview. And we need to help those people recognize we need to back way up and talk about our foundations. I think the virtues or the grounding of the moral life is a good place to start, because it's something we all experience, at least the moral demand or moral failure. And if how can exploring that demand help people be awakened to philosophy, their search for wisdom?
Well, I think in the perennial tradition, one of the main questions of philosophy is, how should I live? And classically conceived, ethics is really about answering that question,
right?
Which is really pretty close to the question of, how can I be happy? And Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is really all about human flourishing, eudaimonia. How can we be happy and live good, well-ordered lives? And the virtues are critical for that. And that's another benefit of starting your philosophical reading sort of deep in the tradition, is that many of the concerns that go back deep in the tradition are the concerns of the ordinary person. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the meaning and purpose of life? How do I live a happy and good life? If you start with modern philosophy, there's a lot of clever puzzle solving, but there's not as much of an emphasis on those perennial human questions.
Yeah.
I would also say, if you're an ordinary person trying to bring faith and reason together, I think combining some sort of exploration of some of these works of moral philosophy with just making sure that you have a regular sacramental life and are going to confession and so forth is really going to help you to bring faith and reason together, right? Like confession really should be an opportunity for us to evaluate how we're doing and confess how we're doing, and then set out and try to do better the next time, right? And if you think of that as being this sort of intellectual and practical, almost like what you would do with a physical trainer at the gym, right? Except you're training your soul instead of your body, right? Then I think that really helps you to kind of get those things in sync to some extent.
Yeah. And this connection between the knowledge and virtue. Would you say that that as Catholics, having role models in the saints and the great writers in the church, does that help us kind of learn that connection through their example, would you say?
I think so. It certainly helped me. The most, in the Catholic tradition, what you often see is the most saintly people are also some of the most brilliant thinkers in the history of the Western tradition. And there really is a bringing together of virtue and knowledge that's very attractive.
Right.
And if you study those people, their lives and their writings, it can really inspire you to want to be like them. And part of the emphasis in thinking about morality from a virtue perspective is the importance of having moral exemplars that you can follow. What should you do? You should do what the virtuous man does. And looking at these Catholic saints and philosophers and theologians, these are good exemplars for us to take our cues from.
I would also say, as just a bit of practical advice, when you're exploring saints and philosophers, which is absolutely a good thing to do, but sometimes you encounter someone who, for whatever reason, they rub you wrong, they're really not speaking to you, you're finding yourself really turned off. It's not always a good idea because, to benefit from any of these people, you're going to have some discipline and stick to it a little bit. But if it's not really just a matter of this is hard, but more like, this is not really speaking to me. Sometimes it's better to just put those people aside, right? The church has so many resources. There can be, a particular example to me, somebody, I don't even remember who anymore, when I was kind of not that far from conversion, so in the year or so before I became a Catholic, gave me St. Louis de Montfort and some of his Marian writings. So I had some questions about Mariology and so on and so forth. And I read that and I was just, it did not please me at all. And I realize now, it's sort of like a personal taste of mine that I don't really like sort of overwrought language and like really emotion-filled rhetoric and that sort of thing. And just St. Louis is just not the guy for you if that's how you are, right? Or at least at that period in my life. So a lot of times you might pick up an author and be turned off for whatever reason and then feel like, this intellectual exploration thing, maybe I'm not a very intellectual person, or maybe this didn't work out. Try someone else, right? Like every person is not going to speak to you at every point in your life, right? But if you sort of pick up this book and that book and sometimes you find the one where you say, this is the book that I need right now in my life, right? And it might be the third or the fourth one that you pick up, right? So you have to kind of keep working at it.
Right. Yeah. You see that reaction to Aquinas, I think. Some people find him dry, crusty, impossible to understand. Other people say, no, it's so clear, it's so succinct, it's so concise and so thorough. If you try Aquinas and you find that you can't handle it, pick up Augustine.
Right.
If you pick up Augustine and find the rhetoric to be too florid, put it down. Pick up Aquinas. Like Rachel said, the tradition is so big.
There's virtue in coming up against something that is beyond you.
Yeah.
I think that's something I think we all experience in reading this kind of stuff. And sometimes it is pushing you beyond, what your comfort zone, beyond the sort of questions you've asked up to this point. We have about 6 minutes left, and one thing I want to ask both of you is, again, the type of questions of philosophy. They as you said earlier, they point us to the big picture to see what's underlying, the things that we deal with every day. Our particular doctrinal beliefs, our practices, virtue. What's the underlying worldview? How do we see the universe that we live in? And from both of your traditions, what were some of the aspects of worldview, how you conceived of the world and of God and of the human person, that are very different now that you're a Catholic?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Jonathan, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the sacramental economy of grace is something that was new to me when I came into the church. I think growing up the way that I did, I really had a Cartesian view of the human person as a kind of ghost in a machine.
Right.
And so the body, it didn't seem to matter that much. Almost a Gnostic deprecation of reality, really. Why care about the world?
Yeah.
Where it's like, if your car is about to go over a cliff, you're not going to try to, stop it and change the oil, But the sacramental economy of grace is itself really based on two ideas in Catholicism: this incarnational view of the world, I think, and then this view of the human person as a soul-body compound. Yeah. The traditional Catholic view is really that the human person is a compound object, not just a ghost in a machine. And if the human person is a compound object of soul and body, then the communication of divine grace through physical instrumentality makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, it makes sense that I should genuflect when Jesus is present in the tabernacle. It makes sense that I should dip my fingers in holy water to remind myself of my baptism.
Yeah.
It makes sense that I should put my knees on the kneeler during the consecration, because I'm a soul-body compound. It makes sense that I should dress up for Mass, because what I do with my body affects my soul, just like what I do with my soul affects my body.
Yeah.
So I think that sacramental, incarnational view of the world is one of the biggest differences for me as a Catholic now.
Yeah. Rachel, any thoughts on that from your background?
I guess the first thing that occurs to me is just that when I became a Catholic, the world, but also the universe felt so much bigger. The sense of being part of this huge Catholic family going back through the saints. There was this sense of historical perspective. There was this sense of just the incredible diversity of the Catholic family. And then also, of course, Mormons have this idea, right, that we're sort of like growing ourselves into gods, right? And if you are a Catholic, you don't have to grow into a god, right? I actually found that kind of comforting in a way, right? It was sort of like, oh, okay, now I feel like I have assumed a more proper place. Although the Christian vision is still glorious, right? I mean, we're still promised you have the potential to become something much better than what you presently are. So it's not like we're just, settling for our present selves, but still there's a sense in which it did feel like I was kind of cut down to an appropriate size.
Yeah. Another thing for me as a oneness Pentecostal, I had a Unitarian conception of God.
Sure.
But as a Trinitarian Christian, I view God as basically a community of three divine persons. Right. And the Catholic idea that God is inviting me into His divine family, that's a beautiful picture of the end of it's in the purpose or telos of human existence. Right. So I think I have a much richer view of the very purpose of my life, not just simply as to go to heaven, but to be invited into the Trinitarian life of God Himself. Yeah. And it gives a dignity to family and friendships and community life, which is a wonderful bulwark against the kind of fragmenting individualism that this kind of atomistic view of the human person that we have today.
I think. Go ahead.
All I was going to say is that it does seem to me as though that broader sense of what God has planned for us and of providence having this sort of direction, right, also makes it easier for us to simultaneously take very seriously the sort of the sin and the fallenness and the injustice of the world, and at the same time not be completely dragged down by that, right? Because we know that there is something else out there.
Right. Yeah, it's that classic both and of Catholicism. It goes back to where we started in terms of mystery, and in terms of, I think Peter Kreeft calls it the Hamlet Principle. Like we're all, as Hamlet says, there's more in heaven and earth than you've dreamt of in all your philosophy.
That's right.
There's this expectation of moreness as Catholics. When we encounter a mystery, we don't reduce the mystery, we don't simplify it, we expect there to be more.
Right.
And with that, we're out of time. But thank you again for joining us for the Journey Home program. And thank you, Jonathan and Rachel, so much for your stories and for your witness and for this wonderful conversation we were able to have. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on the Journey Home program. Have a good night.